We are back here on Wednesday nights, and we're wondering if we're up and running yet, because we might have some. Are we live? It's connecting. All right, talk amongst yourselves for one more minute as we're connecting. Doo, doo, doo. Awesome. Well, again, good evening. We're so glad you're here on Wednesday night as we finish our third part of a series based on our friend Kyle Roberts' book, A Difficult Pregnancy, and we're talking about Mary. That's what I meant. Now, don't buy that book. That's a different book. Complicated Pregnancy. And we actually have a wonderful panel here that's going to be entertaining a few questions. And at the end, there'll be a chance for you to ask maybe some specific questions or give some feedback. So hold those questions towards the end. Unless it's just burning, you have to know exactly what Dave Moss has to say about something very specific. And then we'll interrupt, and he'll answer the question.
It would usually involve a pun.
Yes, it would. So it'd be good for you to know who all these people are. So we're going to invite you to introduce yourselves, and we'll just pass the mic down. And maybe just share your name. Maybe just for fun, just say how long you've been around this community. I think that's fun for people to know. And maybe one thing that you would want them to know about you, just to make it a little more personal.
My name's David Moss. I've been around back and forth with this community probably for about 5 years. Took a hiatus, went to a covenant church for a bit, and then have returned, whatever that means. And just the one thing about me, I met my wife in kindergarten. She was a red mat, I was a blue mat. Too much information.
I don't think I can top that. My name is Christian Nguyen, and I am the teaching minister here, and I've been around the community for about 12 years, I think now. Full-time on staff there for about 5 years. One thing, when I was in 8th grade, I won a breakdance competition.
So the question is, what'd you break?
My name is Janet Havens, and I've been here since 1982. What else are we supposed to say?
One thing about yourself.
One thing about myself is I got a call at 5:10 to be asked to be on the panel because Sarah's sick. So I haven't had a chance to really look at the questions, but I'm going to go for it. I said yes. Isn't that our theme? Say yes.
I saw
say
what
yes.
you did there. Well done.
Say yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm Kyle Roberts. I was a part of this community for a number of years, probably 2014 through 20-something, and had a great time with you all, many of you all, getting to know you and teaching and various things. My family, we live in Minnetonka, now just north of Hopkins High School. Both kids are playing basketball and in sports, so that's where it's nice to be close to the center of gravity where they're always pulling us. So I guess the interesting thing about me is I'm basically now functioning as a non-paid Uber driver for my kids.
My name is Erin Watson. I think we've been at Meetinghouse for 2 years, probably. I was called at 5:29 to be invited to the panel, but even more interesting fact is I'm extraordinarily good at hula hooping.
Hula hooping?
Hula hooping.
Gosh, I wish we had one. Prove it.
Yeah, that would be way more interesting than this conversation. So,
I happen to know where there are too. Yes, we could run down the. Good call.
Well, I want to say it's clear I shouldn't be on the panel. I can't break dance, and I can't hula hoop.
Can you pass that back to him? Well, one of the things that this book and this discussion creates the opportunity for, and to have a panel discussion around this topic, is that one of the outcomes of discussion around this book especially is, and other books that we offer to study in the life of this church, is really not to push an agenda or to force someone to think certain ways. We really are trying to be congregational churches that promote opportunities to think theologically and to challenge some of our own preconceived or early conceived ideas and theological notions. And how do we do theological dialogue? How do we agree and disagree theologically with each other and continue to be a community? And so topics like this, which creates a little bit of a stir for some people, they have strong feelings about it. Others people have kind of lukewarm feelings about it. Some people don't care about it at all. But here we are around these tables having a conversation about a pretty strong historical notion about Christmas if you've grown up in the life of this church. So I thought what would be good for us to do is maybe for the sake for folks who have not been here, maybe just give just 2 minutes about kind of what this book is about and what it suggests as we then begin to have this panel discussion.
2 minutes. 3 minutes. Yeah, I'll keep it short. But yeah, the gist of it is I started off, had an opportunity to write a book about the virgin birth story, and to like a popular theology for the people about the virgin birth. I was going to write actually a kind of more or less traditional defense of the virgin birth from a progressive perspective. But as I got into the research and I started thinking more and more and more, kind of the chinks of the armor of the view that I had inherited, the traditional view that probably most of us are accustomed to and cherish in many respects. More and more questions came to my mind that I had difficulty reconciling, and just researched and found myself on the other side of the equation, on the other side of the issue. And actually, the thesis of the book is that if you believe in the incarnation, that God, the Son of God, became fully human and lived and dwelt among us, the virgin birth story actually is not consistent, really, with a theology of incarnation, of God becoming a true, real human being. And so I actually found myself at odds between these two perspectives or two positions, one being a deep carnation, which I talk about in the book, really a theology of true incarnation or deep incarnation, and the other being the traditional inherited virgin birth or virginal conception story. And so I ended up arguing at the end that, in fact, most likely the way that Jesus came into the world, the mechanism of the incarnation was a normal human act of procreation, sexual procreation, that led to the miracle, if you will, of God becoming flesh in the form of Jesus of Nazareth. And so I didn't start out trying to be the Grinch and take away Christmas, the joy of Christmas for people. That was certainly not the intention. And in fact, I hope it doesn't do that. I hope it does the opposite in the sense of making Christmas all the more meaningful, because it really brings to light and underscores the power of the incarnation itself, the meaning of the incarnation, that Jesus is truly one of us from the same biological evolutionary line as we are, and yet is also God, the Son of God. So that's the gist of the narrative of the story.
That was really helpful. Thank you very much. Kind of all brings us all to the same page right now. I think just for the sake of folks here that are sitting around the tables to get a chance to know who the panel is, maybe we start, and we'll just, since Mike is over there, why don't we start with Aaron? And maybe just what, if anything, did you grow up thinking about, knowing about, being taught about in terms of the virgin birth? Mary and the birth of Jesus. If any of those kind of virgin birth, Mary, Jesus, what did you grow up with? What did you kind of learn from the early stages of your life? So
I grew up in a Missouri Synod Lutheran church, and my family really liked a literal reading of the Bible, and there wasn't even a question. of whether or not it was virgin birth or not. That's just the way it was. And I think there was almost like a pride to the rigidity in which some of those beliefs were just held as like, like, why would you question it? Which I think will lead to the last question we're going to talk about here. But it was really like, this is the way it is. There wasn't really a whole lot of room for even considering that a question should be asked about it.
And you've shared a little bit, but I'm guessing that was very similar to your.
Yeah,
and there's some consequences, I understand, in terms of your family right now, in terms of how people are still frustrated with some of your positions. Is that right?
Yeah, I grew up Southern Baptist, and my dad was a Southern Baptist pastor. My uncle was a Southern Baptist pastor and theologian. And my granddad was a Southern Baptist pastor. So very conservative, probably very similar in the sense of literal inerrancy, meaning there cannot be any errors or problems with the Bible itself. It's a purely, absolutely true historical record and all those things. And so, yeah, that's what I inherited. That's what I grew up with. And as my own theology and positions, perspectives began to diverge from that, it did create some tension. It has created some tension with my uncle, who is basically doesn't talk to me anymore, and I'm sure he would when we end up in the same room together at some point. He will, and we will, but it's created some just tension, underlying tension in the relationship, and but anyway, that's I think in a sense the unintended and undesired consequence of pursuing truth and living into your convictions, and in the way that you feel led to do so, and that it doesn't always land well with everybody that is around us and that is a part of our lives.
Yeah, I grew up with a mother who had a second conversion in 1979 after some very difficult times in her life, and really got sold out. Just voracious Bible reader and prayer, and just an amazing transformation happened in her life. And she became very literal in terms of Scripture, in terms of there was no need to do any understanding of the period of time or the people that was written to. I mean, this is what it says in English today. And I remember when I was in seminary, I would go and just share some thoughts or ideas with her, and she'd go, nope, no. And then she'd get mad and wouldn't return my calls for like 2 days until she settled down. And so I understand that in terms of, okay, you start to shake any part of that foundation that I'm living on, that I take that very personal, and that's really hard. So I think this idea of us having to create some model for us to be able to do some of this kind of conversation and then kind of wrestle with each other. It's one of our core values with some of these things is going to be helpful for us all. So appreciate you sharing that.
It's dangerous to go to seminary.
No, it almost killed me, so it was cemetery.
What do you want?
Oh, the same thing for you.
Oh, same thing.
Yes, please. What did you know when you were growing up, or what did you learn about Jesus, the virgin birth, Mary?
We didn't talk about it much. I grew up in a very faith-filled family, Baptist background, but I've shared when we've sat at tables that we ended up moving overseas, and so we went to whatever church was available, and sometimes it was an American church, sometimes it was a denomination. My folks held deep faith, but they were not dogmatic. So when I would share with them a different belief or some practice somebody in one of the other countries had, they would always come back by saying, the most important thing is to share love, because Jesus loves everybody, and that's what if you want to be a representative of Jesus, you are loving. So we just, Mary was part of it, but I certainly never, ever wondered if she was a virgin or not. I just didn't think about it.
Yeah, actually, my experience was similar to yours. I grew up in the Methodist church, and I don't really remember us ever talking very much at all about Mary. she was one of the characters in the Christmas story, and that was it. It was, and my parents kind of late in high school, my high school time, probably became a little bit more conservative, I suppose. They were kind of heading more. But by that point in time, it was, I was getting ready to leave the house and go to college. So it was just never like something that was kind of drilled into my head. But I think when I did sort of have a early experience, a kind of Christian experience in college, I probably just de facto adopted the traditional theology of Mary, but not without a lot of reflection or thought. So.
Well, I didn't grow up in a home that had a faith tradition. I actually didn't. I had some, what I would describe in a deeper part of my story, spiritual experiences as a child growing up, but it wasn't because we were attending church. My first experience of going to church was after my wife and I were married, and we'd had a couple kids, and it was that, well, we probably want our kids to be able to decide for themselves something, so let's go to church. And my wife's background was Southern Baptist, so we went to, grew up in a Baptist church for a while. I actually have not very much of a memory there. But as we moved to Central Illinois, came involved in a church, and at that point my children were of the cute age to participate in the Christmas program, and I think that's probably the first time I heard the Christmas story, and so of course Mary was a virgin. So that's sort of where the narrative started for me. And then I was also a percussionist, and I played in the worship bands, and so then the other part of my theology was Mary, Did You Know? And other songs that weren't actually, looking back, weren't very helpful. But yeah, I grew up just basically following the narrative that I was told and didn't really put any thought into it.
So if you notice, as we went around this, there's kind of a consistency in terms of just either kind of just accepting the way we learned and grew up, or it was like not a thing that we talked about and we just kind of kept moving forward, which would be how my experience was. We didn't really talk about much in the Presbyterian Church growing up. In Apostles' Creed, we had to learn in confirmation, but that you were just learning that so you could pass and keep going. And so here's a panel of folks that kind of grew up with the same kind of understanding of it and the same basic understanding, with the exception of maybe until later in life when you weren't questioning that. So it might be worth it for us to just say, well, okay, Kyle's book represents a challenge to that we've kind of just accepted or kind of gone along with. This creates an opportunity for us to ask the question, well, should we be the kind of church that wrestles with these kinds of things? Should we be willing to say, oh, let's wade into that? Okay, he raises some interesting points, some ideas, some things I hadn't thought about before. Is that okay? Is that okay to be in a faith community where we can do that? Or should we just be in a faith community that says, you know what, let's not mess with things. Things have been around here for a few thousand years. Let's just go with that. Can we do both? Can we do one or the other? Or what do you guys think? You do, but you don't have to answer because you have the mic. Okay.
No, that's one of the things that I appreciate most about Meetinghouse, is that it seems to be a place, as when people ask me about Meetinghouse, I say, I think we hold theological tensions pretty well. That we try to engage in these conversations, which I really appreciate. For my own faith journey, as I said, I didn't grow up with any faith. I was talking to Kyle before we came in and said that I'm 61 years old, and Kyle and Christian were both seminary professors of mine. So when I went to seminary, I had been through some lived experiences, and then became a chaplain. And so as a chaplain, you encounter people with all kinds of questions, right? And so I think it's really important to be able to sit together, notice where we are, and then approach each other with curiosity, because that makes me learn and deepens my faith in how Jesus shows up and continues to surprise me. So when I have conversations with others, Jesus shows up.
I feel like, as the person who conceived of and organized the entire session, I think I have to say yes to your question, of course. I guess my sense is it certainly will probably echo what we hear up here, but theology is human reflection on the divine. It's our attempt to understand, reflect upon, maybe even put into practice in the face of something that comes upon us that we oftentimes don't really have words for. So there's already a kind of sense in which you're on your back foot, I think, in relation to God, who we're talking about. And because of that, because life happens, because our experiences of the divine happen, and because they're also different, how can we not be a community in which there are going to be different views, different theologies, different experiences? So the real question becomes, how can we be people of conviction that can hold those convictions and yet also hold a sort of open mind, open hand? And so I think this is a great kind of exercise for us in that way. So
I'm gonna let you guys fight over this mic as I make a comment. I did a funeral today for one of our members, and in making kind of giving an invitation to the congregation that was gathered, most of which were not, Meetinghouse people. I said I was making a point about God's faithfulness, and I said, so if my Bible is true, and then I made a point about God's promise, and as an invitation for people to kind of, can you get there? Are you with me on this? Is this something you can believe? Is this hopeful and helpful for you? That's why I did it. I was at the reception for a few minutes, and this guy came up to me, and he said, I really liked what you had to say. I appreciated that. It's thoughtful. He said, except I had one problem. He says, you asked the question, if your Bible was true. He says, of course the Bible is true. I said, well, that wasn't really the point I was making. The point I was trying to make, he goes, I know, but that's leading people down a path you don't want them to go. And I said, well, did you understand what I was trying to do? And I said, because I was trying to lead them to a place where they could at least, he didn't want to hear any of it because I had said the wrong sentence. And I thought, I don't think we want to be that kind of church where we can't even, we even question some of the wording, because if it doesn't come out exactly the way we're expecting it to, then somehow it's wrong or somehow it doesn't fit or some. And so, I mean, some of those allowances that we have to create just to create some space. I love what you said about showing up with some wonder, some curiosity, some, how did you get there? What does that mean? How does that work for you, as opposed to, you didn't do that right, you said that wrong, that wasn't the correct way to approach that. And I think that's where the world we are in right now, and that's what creates a lot of the difficulties that we're having as a community, as a country. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I've heard that a lot in my many years of teaching formally in an evangelical seminary context. People very concerned about the truth and what the Bible being true. Well, I learned in a different evangelical context many years ago, seminary where I did my PhD, the question, not is the Bible true or not true, but what is it true? What is true about the Bible, or what is true about that story? Or what is true about that message? What is that story conveying? How are we meant to interpret and do constructive theology, to your point, Christian, on the basis of that text or of that story? And so I think I would affirm this person's, comment about the concern about the truth. I should think we should all be concerned about the truth these days, right? Any day. But what is it true about, or what is true about it? What is the message that it is conveying? And when you start there, I think a community of faith can wrestle with the text and in an open-handed way, in a way that affirms the importance of the Scripture, the importance of discerning its meaning, but is open-handed about the message that should be and should be conveying to us as a community, to you as a community, in this day, in this time.
I think that the thing that opens up the ability to wrestle and to be part of a community where we can all have constructive perspectives is educating ourselves, like your book helped to do, about the context, about the history, about how to even understand what that truth might have been in that time. I find that so helpful. And I think it just allows more thoughtful conversation when everyone has that as a foundation. So it's not just sort of like, no, like let's look at what it says. Let's educate ourselves about the history and about different perspectives, and then start there, and build into that curiosity and inquiry and just thoughtfulness. That feels really healthy to me, and I really have enjoyed in my life, the more I really learn deeply about how to even understand something, it just helps that type of conversation.
You know what I really liked what you said, Aaron, is I think we all do that anyway. I think just saying that out loud, that as a part of the environment of which we're actually operating in is healthier, as opposed to us just doing it on our own private, why can't we agree that that's the environment we're living in, and then honestly show up in that situation. So,
I have one thing.
yes. You
can do this one? Okay. Thinking about this question. I don't know if these are the right words, but I don't think I think theologically. And so I don't try to take apart the scriptures, and I love it when I learn the Hebrew and the Greek, and I love to study the Bible, but I don't think I think theologically. But what I care about deeply, deeply, deeply is how you think about it. What do you think? And this is kind of how I look at it. If I hold to something dogmatically and rigidly, that might be a stumbling block to you, then I've got a big problem. Because the whole story of the Bible is how to share Jesus Christ with one another. So that's why I love the book, because I felt like I never thought about it. I don't mean to sound blasé, but I don't care if she was a virgin or not. She held the Son of God. We went forward, and what matters is the resurrection, the cross and the resurrection. Remember, I'm saying this non-theologically, but I care a lot if you think she wasn't a virgin, and I'm going to hold back from loving you. If you think she wasn't, and I think she was, and that holds me back, then that's a big problem. That's why I loved the book, because I never thought about it, but I thought, wow, if prior to reading the book, I had met somebody who was just very sure that Mary wasn't a virgin, I don't think I would have held them at bay, but I said, really? Well, the Bible says she's a virgin. Oh, yeah, okay. I loved it, and that's why I loved it, because I feel it helps me to understand better how other people think.
But there's whole denominations of churches that have very specific, clear understandings theologically, and so there's no reason to have those conversations. And so there's no division there because the people just don't go there. Or they're not welcome if they do, or they don't feel welcome if they do. I think that's one of the things that in the congregational tradition that offers is, and I had a conversation with a visitor a couple weeks ago who wanted to know what our position was on a number of social issues. And I said, well, start talking to the folks here in the common. You might find 2 or 3 different versions of each of those issues. I said, that's at the heart of the congregation. And he's like, well, I don't think I would feel comfortable. I said, well, then you should find a church that maybe is more aligned with some of those feelings and beliefs that you have. Or stay here and be a part of the conversation. I haven't seen him since, but as you might guess. But I think that that's what actually happens, is in terms of us saying, how can I recognize that as a problem and work at trying to lower some of those barriers or those concerns or the things that separate us, create a space where that can happen. I think what we just say is we disagree, so you're either going to go somewhere else or I'm going to go somewhere else. And then we have a big problem, right? Then we end up with all these different segments of the church. So did anybody else have a comment? Awesome. This specific issue raises a question of we talked about how you guys grew up and some of the things you learned young or learned as you first became a part of a faith community. Has this issue or issues like it, Has it challenged your theological understanding of how you approach things theologically? Has this specific issue have you grown in some way or altered it in some way that you might be willing to share? Or it could be any other big issue if you wanted to, but how has, as you've grown as an adult or matured as an adult, how has your theological willingness to look at some of the issues and concerns of your faith been challenged or grown or expanded or?
I think I think I was probably more conservative. When I came back to the United States, I went to a very conservative boarding school, a lot of very conservative stuff. But again, I still didn't think a lot about these things. Now, wait a minute. I lost my train of thought. What was the question? I started thinking about boarding school. What was the question?
Have you changed in terms of how you approach things theologically in your life?
Yes. So the question, yes. So, yes, because I think I've come to say Christ is the center, love is the center. And so I look at things theologically in a sense from that. And how does it work out in daily life? Loving others. Hold it lightly. Don't hold Jesus Christ lightly. Hold a lot of the other things lightly.
So I went to school for a long time, got my PhD, and I was around a lot of people who knew a lot of things. But I realized the more I learned, the more I realized I really don't know a whole lot about anything. And I think that is how my understanding of some of these profoundly complicated topics has evolved. Whereas a child, it was laid out very simply. Mm-hmm. This is the way it is. This is what you believe. There's not really a point to ask questions. And it all started falling apart for me in high school when I would ask questions. And I didn't really get good answers, and so I was like, well, I'm out of here. But I came back to my curiosity around faith in my 20s and started reading things that got me curious again. And in fact, I just remembered I read a book by Rob Bell that said something about, there was like a question, was Mary actually a virgin? And I didn't remember I read that until the other day, after hearing you. But like those little curiosities of like, maybe there is more to this, and there's more mystery to it than I was taught, which intrigued me. And I think I've just become really comfortable with appreciating that we can't know everything, and that God is so mysterious and big and complex that it's arrogant to imagine that we can know it perfectly. And so it's just like a comfort of, I'm going to try to figure this out because I'm curious and I love thinking about those things, but I'm not going to like hold so firmly and see it more as a journey of discovery that, hey, maybe one day when I'm with God, we can chat about great things and I'll like have greater understanding, but right now it's okay. Like I'm just moving in the right direction.
Yeah, you just made me think, Aaron, of not so much the Rob Bell book, but I mentioned at the end of my book, which has surprisingly gone kind of mostly unnoticed, probably because people stop reading it halfway through. But at the end, not everyone. You read it all the way through. Yeah. Yeah.
And she gave even more compliments last week when you weren't here.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
I should have been here last week. The Andy Stanley, episode where the pastor is mega church pastor, son of a famous pastor, Charles Stanley, but he is a great pastor in his own right, popular preacher, whatever. Preached a few sermons, I guess, a series of sermons where he asked questions later. or essentially gave permission to his congregants to have those kinds of questions, and the virgin birth was one of them. Like, maybe not. He just, for a pastor like that in the denomination, the Southern Baptist denomination of which he's a part, to grant that kind of permission explicitly to his congregants was a pretty major deal, and the gatekeepers jumped on him, and nope, you have to draw the lines over here. But I think what his impulse is right where you all are in trying to open up opportunities within a congregation for people to really have questions, think about them. And I think that's energizing. It's energizing for younger people too, who want to really openly deal with these kinds of things. We get a lot of them in seminary. They come to seminary because that's where they can safely have these kinds of conversations. But in many cases, their churches they can't do that, or the churches they come from, they can't do that.
Were you going to say something?
Did you have a comment?
I was going to make a comment. These kinds of conversations just make people uncomfortable. And the reason is or some people are uncomfortable, because you're like, you know what? I've got my little box. And every time you're asking me to step outside my box, it feels like this box is not just a box, it's like a house of cards. Is my faith going to all tumbling down? And these are the things I believe. These are the things that I got worked out. And don't shake at that foundation, because what will I have if it all kind of comes tumbling down? Of course, what we know about a house of cards is it's pretty fragile anyway, right? So a stiff wind or a hard situation in life, circumstance, a situation, a question, could get it to come tumbling down as well. Tony Campolo has a comment that has guided me for 30 years, and he said, I heard him say this live, where he said, hold on to your theology loosely, because at best it's heresy. He says, a finite human being trying to understand an infinite God. And I'm like, And that 30 years ago, if you remember me 30 years ago, I was a lot more conservative than I am today. And I was like, that opened up, that actually kind of put a little sturdiness around some of that house of cards that, I'd already been in seminary. I had already had worked through some of those issues. So I think the encouragement for us is to solidify the foundation upon which we're building our faith by asking, at least pondering or wondering about some of these questions that may significantly give us a sturdier foundation to live on, or encourage us to think something differently and go a different direction, and build it in a new and stronger way. So,
When's Christian's
done? What was the question again?
Has your theological change, the way that you approach things theologically changed as you've grown older?
Yeah.
I figured that's what he's going to say.
I mean, I don't know how I can't. I guess there are some people like in the old Princeton school that were like, we're proud that nothing has ever been taught here that is new compared to what was taught by the apostles. That's supposed to be a joke, but I don't think I told it very well.
I thought there was going to be a period. We have never taught anything.
Yeah. Period. There you go.
Maybe a more interesting question is what allowed you to have that evolution. Like, I think that everyone has it, but what prompted it?
Well, what prompted it for me was simply the feeling of the provisionality of theology, that it's provisional. That to the best of my ability and based on what I have in front of me, this is what I believe right now. And that realizing that confession is a confession of faith. It is provisional. It's not like, it's not the thing itself. The thing itself is what you're trying to point to and talk about. And I think it's very important, I feel like, to recognize the difference between our ideas of God and God, essentially, and that there's a gap. When I think about the Mary evolution, it just was never a question, really, much of a live question. And it really wasn't until I was in graduate school, and was able to take classes at a Greek Orthodox seminary where there was a little bit more of a kind of question about who is Mary, and they utilized the language of Theotokos and the God-bearer. And so the recognition that in some ways, whatever you say about Mary, you're really saying something about Jesus was important. And then later, reading feminist authors and sort of struggling and coming to see Mary, especially through the lens of the Magnificat and and I felt like I still feel like I'm kind of anticipating what I think is supposed to be the last question, but I feel like what we're really trying to do when we talk about a doctrine or an idea like, was Mary a virgin or not, is we're trying to say something about the divine origin, and we're trying to say something about the scandalous nature. And it seems to me there are different ways that you could put that puzzle together. It doesn't require a traditional doctrine. There's other ways to do it. So anyway, I don't know if that, I think that kind of gets at it a little bit, but a lot of it just also comes through practice. You just have to do it. You have to try to think about and I found myself in seminary oftentimes going through seasons of questioning most everything, and part of the reason why is because I was going to school. I was a Protestant going to school with the Orthodox. I was, hanging out with people who didn't have faith. Or I went to Africa and the World Council of Churches, which will challenge, if you ever think that only your way of doing church, and you meet the thousands of other ways of doing church. And when you get put in those kinds of settings and situations, you either become flexible and start to think about this, or you collapse. And I kind of feel a little bit, I know that those are unique to graduate school and stuff, but I feel a little bit like life throws you those curveballs. And you either learn to be supple and let it break what it needs to break, or the whole thing, I think, would break, I guess. So it feels like a life orientation in a way.
I was going to say I honestly hadn't pondered this question until about 36 hours ago when Christian called and said, "Hey, do you want to be on this panel?"
Really giving up our secrets here.
I hadn't read Kyle's book, but I went back and watched his presentation on the Meetinghouse website, and I said, "Huh." And for myself, when I'm wrestling with those things, either because of a new idea has sort of sprung up, and I'm like, what do I do with that? Or a new life experience has presented itself to me, and I go, what do I do with that? My own filter is, is this going to get in the way of me seeing Jesus as fully human and fully God? And as I pondered that and watched it, I go, nope, doesn't do that. And then I say, well, is this going to get in the way of me loving myself, loving my neighbor, or loving God? If it doesn't get in the way of those things, then I'm, I really wrestle with it. And, after listening to Kyle's presentation, I'm like, I actually do think, the incarnation is amplified if I really look at it as a biological birth. And the incarnation happens, and I would also say that's miraculous. I have no explanation for how that then comes to be, other than I just do. And then I was pondering, how does that sort of run threads through other things that I think? And I think that it made me see God less gendered, which I think for myself and the way I was raised is a good thing. Because if I don't see as God sort of, just turning into a sperm or whatever, that makes it God feel less male and bigger than in some way. And so I appreciate that way of just being brought into thinking about God in a little less gendered way, which is, I'm surrounded by every day, mostly in the conversations that I'm involved in or hear about. And so I just appreciated the opportunity to just in the last 36 hours to say, all right, what's this mean for my faith? I have some other tendrils around that and questions around that I'll engage with as time goes on. But I always hold my faith Someone said, hold it like a bird, gentle, but don't kill it. And so I try to just hold it sort of gentle and don't kill it, because I don't think the faith is the one that is threatening as much as I'm threatening to it, unless I'm open. So.
Well, I said this the very first time we met with Kyle, that when they said we were going to came out that we were going to study his book, I was mad. I was like, are you serious? At Advent, we're going to have to look at this? Who picked this book? Who was thinking about that? And I thought, that sounds like a Sarah thing. Oh, Sarah, why did you do that? But if we're going to have a book, this is just me. If we're going to have a book study, I'm like, okay, this is an opportunity. So I read the book. I'm one of those that reads the books, and highlight it, and But I went into it with a bad attitude, like, oh, I don't want to think. This is what I thought. I don't want to think about it. I want to just rest in Advent. I want to sit quietly and meditate with lights, candles, I don't know, a cup of cocoa, and just meditate. I do not want to go into it thinking. It has been really what you intended the book to do, it did for me. Because it has so enhanced my Advent. Because I've thought a lot. Instead of just being quiet, I've done a lot of, I had to think. And this is a little bit off topic as far as the questions, and I think maybe I said this the last time, but I think it's on the last page of the book. Number 1 is I learned a new word that I did not know because I'm not a theology person. But basically, I believe what you said was something about the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. Is that the word? I loved it because the way, and I don't have the book in front of me, but basically orthopraxy is putting your faith in action, where, these are my words, not Kyle's. Orthodoxy is your beliefs. Orthopraxy is putting your faith in action. And in a sense, who cares what I believe if I can't put that love in action? Somehow, the book has helped me grapple in a new way. Obviously, it's a God thing, the book is great, but it's not that great. But it really, but it did something for me. It helped me to think more deeply. And in the end, it came out, I have to say at the end, I thought, I still don't care whether Mary was a virgin or not, but if it helps me be there for somebody else in the world who it matters to, I'm so glad I read the book. I'm so glad I've thought about it. So I guess that's what I had to say.
Thank you. As I'm looking over at one of our wonderful doctors of our church, I think about the work that she does every day, and I think about how over just my lifetime, how medicine has changed and how doctors have approached their work differently. I think about just the way, the other day I had to go to the dentist and how I used to get a filling and now how I get a filling now. How we've approached in so many areas of our life, and we've grown and we've matured and we've changed and we rethink, and it's on the table for most everything in our life, except for oftentimes with faith issues. It's like it's off the table. We don't want to talk about it, we don't want to think about it, because what if, right? If we have to change. So that leads into the last question that apparently everybody's been dreading. I'm just kidding. I'm just going to read it as you wrote it, okay?
That one?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Is that not the last one? That's what I thought. I'll start with why. Why, and if so, how, do you think the theology of Mary and the birth of Jesus matters for Christian theology, faith, and practice? In other words, what is at stake? What's at stake for us to have this kind of conversation, to think theologically around this issue, or even think in terms of practical faith of What if we were to change our mind? What if we go, oh, Kyle's right, totally sold me on this, and that's how we're going to go forward? I mean, what's at stake if we were to think like that or be challenged like that and wonder about that and maybe even change our mind? So, I mean, I've read the book, and there definitely was one point that I hadn't even thought of before, which was pretty compelling in terms of the fact that Paul never talked about it. I'd never even thought about that, which is kind of a big deal for Paul not to talk about it. So I've been thinking about that ever since, which has led me to other things that I've been thinking about and wondering about, which is kind of the whole point of thinking theologically, right? So what's at stake? Is it okay for us to think this way? Is it okay for us to change the way we think about things? Has this affect you in any way that may be helpful for the rest of us? It is a hard question.
I think I'll try to come at this from the sideways. I mean, first of all, just a pair. I feel like there's just a pair. I just wanted to do an amen. I think one of the most interesting things in the book, there was out of several, was the way you point out with Paul. It's not just that Paul doesn't talk about it; it's the language that Paul uses in terms of him from the seed of David, that raises very interesting questions about how did Paul think about. I'm Trinitarian in my theology. But I don't think Paul's operating with some sort of Nicene Trinitarianism in the way that and yet he's very much at the center of the story, and we would think he's a person of faith. And I love Janet's comments, and it just reminded me of one of my favorite Wesley quips, which is, "The devil himself is orthodox, but very far from the true religion of the heart." And that, in a sense, to me, is like a guiding way of thinking about our relationship to these, some of these ideas, I think. What's at stake for me, I feel like, I guess I operate with the affirmation that some of what we say, or maybe a lot of what we say about Mary, we're also saying about Jesus. That there's a deep connection there, and therefore, as we think about what we're saying about Mary, we want to think about, how does that impact what we're saying about Jesus? I think one of the things that helped me in my own journey was realizing, though, that if it's 90% about Jesus, there's an awful lot of there in that 10% about Mary, right? As a young woman. As someone who says yes, who could have said no, which is my own, I think that's the case, who in the Magnificat is one of the lowly. And the lowly there is not someone who's simply psychologically humble, but someone who is crushed, who's lifted up. One of the reasons why I'm not fully able to move totally into where you are, Kyle, but where I see, I can see how it could be, like I'm in process, I suppose, is that sort of strike against patriarchy that the virgin birth sort of symbolizes, that God does this, and in a way that completely upends the way that people think the entire world works at the time. So back then to what I said before, right, is the divine origin. But even that, that's not overly important to Paul. But also questionable parentage. Also not entirely important to Paul, but certainly you can see how that. So I feel like those are sort of the pieces that are at stake a little bit. But the way I'm even talking right now, I feel like it's a shotgun instead of a bullet. It's kind of all over the place. And the reason why I think I speak like that right now is because I don't have a systematic vision or view of Mary, because I don't know exactly what is at stake precisely, in part because what I think the center of the faith has more to do with the resurrection than with the virgin birth, I guess. So I suppose that's kind of when I think about it, that's kind of how I operate.
I think I covered it in my last answer, so I'm just going to pass.
We could do one more from the panel, and then we're going to take some questions from the gathered folks. Either one of the three of you want to share something?
I really like how at the end you were talking about this perspective of the story allows us just to empathize more and see ourselves more in Jesus, because Jesus is truly human, you know, and all of the, as a woman who's given birth to 2 children, it makes me feel a little closer to Mary, you know, that this is just sort of, I don't know, it makes it feel more real. In fact, I think that was one of the points that was raised in our group discussion last week by a midwife, was it makes it feel a whole lot more real, this interpretation, which I think it does a bit for me too. But I think maybe even more importantly, our ability as a congregation to really wrestle respectfully with these things and stay curious instead of accusatory, you know, and just be okay with not knowing everything, I think is a really good thing, you know? And it allows us all just to like be with each other in this messy world. So I've enjoyed even seeing, I think, a bit of an evolution in our group with being able to sit with this complex topic and at least listen, you know, and ask good questions. So I think it's extraordinarily important, and it's good for a parent of young kids that my kids can observe a community that's able to do this. So I guess I'm just appreciative for the opportunity.
I've only been here for 40 years, and there was a history before me, for sure, obviously. But my experience in the 40 years I've been here is that this has been a place where this church, this specific church, has been a place where people can come with their questions and wrestle. Long before it was one of our spoken core values, we were a place where people could come wrestle. They could come from other places and other circumstances, situations. We used to talk about they were recovering this and recovering that, and they'd show up here in the life of this church, and they could come with their questions and ideas. And we would wrestle with them. It didn't mean that people didn't have strong opinions. It didn't mean that leadership didn't have strong opinions about certain things. But they were still welcome to be here and with their questions and with their uncertainty about certain things. And that's one of the things I've loved and appreciated about this place. We currently are investing and have for the last couple of years invested significant amount of resources, time and energy and staffing in creating a space that's just for that. The alternative service was a vision of a few years ago to say, let's create a place where people can come with their questions, that maybe don't say, okay, I've got that all figured out, just like you got it all figured out, and I'll come join you now. They said, well, my faith journey's been messy, or my faith journey was stunted because of an experience that I had, or on and on and on. We try to create a place where people can come without all the answers, with all it all figured out, without a complete agreement, and they feel welcome and feel safe. So this congregation has created a place. What's at stake is if we don't continue to do that, is that we're not going to be that place. And I think that's one of the, I think that's one of the opportunities that this congregation, I think it's one of the callings that is upon this congregation right now, and the opportunity that it presents for us to be something hopeful and different in the community. So I didn't mean for the senior pastor to have the last word. But questions that you might have, that you might want to ask something that was said by one of the panelists. Maybe you want to ask the author a question. Maybe you want to make a comment about something or respond to one of the questions that we asked. This would be a great chance for you to do that. Anybody? Oh, yes.
I have a couple things. So Jesus was always thinking outside the box, going outside the rules, going outside the norm. And I believe, as a lover of Jesus, that that's what I'm called to do. So when I first heard about this title, it didn't really sway me any way. I mean, the Christmas story that we've all heard forever, for many of us, since, hearing it, my dad used to read it out loud, There's many things in that story that have either been omitted and we've added our words to, like the Magi. We don't know that there was 3, but every song says that there was 3 wise men. I mean, all of those things. So that's kind of my filter. And I'm really with Janet on, okay, so I love Jesus. Jesus is the core of my faith. And I get sad when people take things so dogmatically that they can't see Jesus. And that's what I just keep coming back to. My heart and my soul gets hurt when there's such lines in the sand. And so, Kyle, I give you great applause for writing this book because it probably does open some doors to some good thinking. The other funny thing is the Jewish faith is matriarchal. If the mother is Jewish, then the child is Jewish. That's what I remember from my religion classes back at Luther. And yet, in the genealogy, it goes from the line of David down. I just think it's kind of interesting. So.
Can I make just a comment? Okay. I just saw all the children out there. They're practicing for the children's pageant. But thinking about a place where we have questions. There's a little girl that comes on Sunday mornings. She just turned 10. She's adamant that she does not believe in God. And she lets Colleen know that. And she lets her grandmother, who brings her, know that. And the response is just wonderful. Like, you don't have to believe in God. You can still do the craft. You don't have to believe in God. That's okay, And so as they came for the pageant, she told Colleen she wanted to be a dragon. And she didn't want to be an angel. She didn't want to be a donkey. And Colleen said, well, I think we can find a place for a dragon in this story, in the Christmas story. Well, now, I will tell you, she has changed. She decided she wanted to be an angel. But her grandmother, who is a good friend of mine, has been so moved by that we will make a place for a dragon. We'll find a way. And I have a granddaughter who I ended up raising after my son died. And Jeff knows very well how terrifically she struggled. Definitely did not believe in God. Didn't believe in most everything. And she's 27 now, and she said 3 months ago something about coming to church, and I'm like, what? Who's this? And she said, yeah, I want to go where my pastor is, Jeff. And I'm thinking, you even know his name? But the love that is shown through, and Jeff was wonderful to her. I mean, not just being you. I mean, you gave her a hug, even though she was probably stiff, like, get away from me. But the love that is shown, despite where someone is I believe that comes across. I believe that comes across, and that's what then people who are interested can have these more technical conversations, which are fascinating and rich. But I think this, where we want to be as a church, it comes through.
A friend of mine sent me a little video clip, and it's in Texas, and they were dealing with the issue of abortion. And this is not the point to discuss this, but the one person is holding the sign, "Because I love Jesus," and the video is him yelling so vehemently, the spit's coming out of his mouth, yelling, "I hate you!" And I thought, now there is a commentary of where our world is right there. So, yeah, I'm coming.
Thank you, all of you guys. I think it was interesting to me that the panel started with the question of like, how did you grow up? Does that make sense, knowing Mary? And then ending with what does this wrestling mean and why does this matter? And I think it's so interesting for those of us who are raising little kids now, it's really a big deal. And so I have a 5-year-old who will be Mary in the school Christmas play on Friday. And she's asking questions that make sense and figuring things out and is so excited. I have a 7-year-old son who on the way to school is like, okay, here's my question for my teacher today. If Mary and Joseph were not married, how did she possibly have a baby? And before I could even say anything, it was so sweet because my daughter then goes, well, so-and-so has 2 kids and she's not married and so-and-so. So it's fun to hear that, but then to be able to have those conversations, hopefully different than, well, it just is. Does that make sense? We have to believe it. This is what it says. And to be able to wrestle and to be able to grow hopefully faithful kids who know from the very beginning that you can question and you can ask and you can learn. Does that make sense? And things might change. One of the questions, and Kyle, kind of for you, but Kristen, also for you, and I think for me it's parents, does that make sense, who are doing this, is it came up in one of our small groups this week of how do we raise our kids with enough of a scaffolding that they grow to know God and to know our faith, but without having to deconstruct too much that wounded them in a way that a lot of us, of my generation, grew up, especially if we grew up on a more conservative theological side. That has caused a lot of my generation to completely leave the church, to either say, like, this, I've been told I cannot ask, I've been told I cannot think. Does that make sense? I've been told that I cannot wrestle, and therefore I'm done. I am incredibly thankful that was not true for me and my story, and part of why I'm here is because we can think and we can wrestle. Does that make sense? And we can do that. But as parents, what worked, what do we not do? But like whether it's with Mary, does that make sense? Whether the other aspects is like, how do we do this? And then as a church, with the youth in our church, to give them both the scaffolding and construction, but without harming.
I'm sorry. I thought of a story. Just to give you a clue of what I was dealing with in my home. One night I put Elijah to bed, and I would, like we would read or pray or whatever. And at the end of the prayer, Elijah goes, "Dad, can you be God and I'll be Jesus?" And he was like, literally like, I'm gonna be Jesus. And I was like, no, I don't think it's gonna work that way. I mean, I bet you already know the answer intuitively to some of the questions that you're asking, because you already know that it's okay for them to ask questions, right? The door is open, and the sense that what Jesus really stands for, right, is genuine love and care for others. And so having a way to both say that in its affirmative possibility, but also when bad things, like so this, they see, okay, that there is, like Jesus stands against certain kinds of things, I suppose. But I think figuring out, in your own kinds of context, it's that open sense of dialogue. That's been my experience. And for me, it was bound up also with my own vocational identity. I did not want my kids to feel like I was trying to say, you have to become theologians and pastors and et cetera, et cetera. They needed to figure out what they believed for themselves. That's kind of what I felt like, I guess.
As you're passing it down to Kyle, who actually has the real answer, I would agree with what Christian said, and I think for parents, you all know this, parents, grandparents, family, we're the primary spiritual teachers in the young people's lives that we interact with. They're looking at us, they're listening to us, they're following and tracking with us in terms of what we say, how we live, how consistently we live out that we're doing that all the time. And so to find those places along the line where we can make those connections for them, or set aside times, like you said, can we build a scaffolding that's, I mean, the way we do that is by actually putting some pieces together, by telling the stories, by sharing the stories, and saying, here's kind of a complicated part of this story, or this is even hard for me to believe sometimes, but it's a story that's a part of our faith, and let's wrestle with that together. What would be the important point that would come out of that, or what would be the idea that's there if we have a hard time believing the whole story? What would be, is there some other part of the theme that we could draw, and this is how it's guiding my life? That'd be one thing I would just say.
The real answer is you just give your kids the catechism and say the
Yes.
answers are there.
I knew you were going to, that. Of course. Which catechism?
It's the shorter catechism. It's always the one I like. No, I think everything you all have said is great and brilliant, and that I think what pulses throughout my book, especially at the end, is the more human, more human, more human. More human God, more human Jesus, more human Mary, more human faith, really. And I think we need a more human relation to or embodiment of our faith and our Christianity. And that's, again, what the incarnation is all about. And so it's weird to me to think when people say, well, if the Son of God was incarnate through a normal human conception and normal human birth, like, big deal. Well, if you've ever witnessed a birth, and are you a doctor? Did I hear over here? And you've witnessed some births. There's nothing blasé about that, right? Like, these are beautiful, remarkable, might even say miraculous moments. And so why would that be a diminishment, again, if that's the mechanism? So I just want to elevate, like when my kids are 11 and 13, and so we are having these conversations about faith and Christianity, and where did Christianity come from? Well, it began as a Jewish sect, right? And so, let's talk about that, and that's interesting. So just kind of taking it apart a little bit, letting our kids take it apart and explore it and ask those questions, that elevates the beauty of it, I think, rather than diminishing it.
It's time to go. But I want to say one quick thing because it's about kids. So, and kind of how you talk with them about the faith. I picked up the 3-year-old from nursery school, and we were driving down 50th, and there were a lot of beautiful houses. And she said, these houses are beautiful. I said, yeah, they are. And she said, wonder where's Jesus' house? And I said, well, he doesn't really have a house like that. And she said, yes, he does. And I said, well, remember Jesus lives in heaven now, and he lives in our hearts. And she said, you know where his house is. And she was almost 4, and so she's very adamant. She says, you know where his house is. And I said, honey, I don't. Because he doesn't have a house. She said, yes, he does. I said, I'm trying to think about how do I help this? And she said, it's in your basement. And she said, it's in your basement. And I'm trying to think, what in the world? And I said, honey, no, Jesus does not live in the basement. And she said, yes, he does. And she said, he's in the closet under the stairs. And I realized she meant the creche with baby Jesus in it. So anyway, we work on it.
Elgin, you get the last word.
Yeah, I just like to make a quick observation that I think you've taken wrestling with this class to a more explicit level as to whether or not the virgin birth is valid or not as we have known it. I mean, we've had other classes on different things and learned different stuff, but that hasn't been the focal point. And I find being explicit about wrestling really helpful because God is a mystery. My faith is a mystery. And I need to ponder on that, and this forces me to do that. And I thank you all very much for contributing to that.
Christian, thanks for setting this up, and thanks for all of you who are willing to do this even on short notice. But next time we ask you, don't give up the news. We've been working on this for months. Let me close this in prayer. God, thanks for this chance for us to be together. Thanks for us to do some wrestling just in sharing what we experience and where we've come from and what means something to us and upon which our lives are being built. And Lord, as we think about passing on the faith and encouraging our young people to know you and to experience you and to trust you, Lord, we pray that you'll inspire and encourage each one who is in the life of young people to encourage them along their journey as you've created them to be. So God, thanks for this conversation. Thanks for the challenge that it represented for us. And we look forward to continuing on this Advent journey because we know the story of your birth in all of its complications is the story of hope. So God, fill us with that hope, we pray in your name. Amen. You want to give 1 second advertisement about your class coming up?
Yeah, and can I just do one more small, like Elijah story? Okay. Julie is in the car driving with Elijah. He's probably like 3 years old. He's in the back. They're driving down 212, and you can see Wooddale. And as they're driving by, he's like, "What is that, Mom?" I'm like, "What is it?" She's like, "Oh, that's the church." He's like, "What is a church?" He's, "Oh, yeah, like that's where Jesus lives." And he goes, "That's not Chuck E. Cheese's." All right. Sorry. So next class will be this our next book will be a book called Living into Community. It's a book written by Christine Pohl. She passed away a couple years ago. But she was very instrumental in recovering hospitality as a central Christian virtue. And so this idea of community and hospitality, that's kind of what we're going to be wrestling with as we move into January. And then we're going to have another book after that called Why the Mystics Matter Now. So those are the next two topics that are coming up as we move into the spring.
Fascinating stuff. Have a good rest of your evening.